Russell, let's talk about taxes on death across Africa. What type of taxes can arise on a person's death?
Right, as normal, it's plenty. The obvious candidates are estate duty or inheritance tax, and these things go by different names in different places. But you shouldn't forget the possibilities of capital gains tax or stamp duty or VAT. Bear in mind that an asset's going to be transferred, and depending on how well drafted the exemptions have been, will depend on what taxes there are. The other point I think is in the case of estate duty or inheritance tax in particular, don't just look at the country where the asset is, sorry, where the person is, the deceased, but also where the asset is. And you might think, well, my home country, we haven't got death tax, but all your assets are in country A, where they have. And they'll say, we're going to tax it.
And generally, Russell, do African countries have a levy estate duty?
A minority, I would say, but there are a good crop of them. A lot of them don't have, but a rather too high a number have in my mind. Bear in mind they're really taxing the elite, and it's quite a complex area. But sometimes the rates can be very high. When I looked at it before, I picked up the outlier, probably Mayotte and Reunion, which of course are not countries at all. They're bits of France floating around the Indian Ocean, and they pay the French rates for enjoying the privilege of being part of France, if that's the right phrasing. But they can be very high. Don't assume there's no tax. Another one on that one is Nigeria. You will look in vain for an estate duty or an inheritance tax in the Nigerian tax code, because it's not there. But they do have a tax. Where it's hiding is in the rules of the High Court, and they call it probate duty.
Interesting. So there can be different names and different places where the tax rules are lurking.
Yep, that's right. And that particular one is quite a well hidden tax. Quite well hidden, but it's a bit nasty when they come along and say 10% of the estate, please.
And Russell, how are death taxes generally settled across Africa?
I think they're generally settled in cash at the time you're trying to wind up the estate. Cash, obviously not necessarily a big bag of cash, but a transfer of a payment to the tax authority, and that can be a problem. Now, if my estate is largely cash in the bank, then it's relatively easy for the executor to pay it. If it's a property or shares in a business, a private company, that can be both difficult to realize enough of the assets, and has a detrimental effect on the legacy you were hoping to pass to your legatees. Not just because there's something that's got to be realised and the big tax chunk taken out of the estate, but also it may be they don't have the asset any longer. How do you pay, I don't know, 30% tax on a house, or on a private company where nobody wants to buy a portion of the shares, they want to buy the whole lot. So suddenly, instead of leaving your company to your legatees, you're leaving a pile of cash from being the somewhat forced sale proceeds.
Yeah, and I find this really interesting, Russell, because in my experience across Africa, so again, excluding South Africa and Mauritius doesn't even have any estate duty or inheritance tax. But in my experience, first of all, a lot of people are not aware that estate duty of any type will apply. And as you say, often it might not apply in the country in which they're resident, but it would certainly apply in the country in which their assets are based. So there's that situs tax. But also, it seems to me that there is a reluctance to consider estate planning before let's say the main owner of wealth passes, and there seems to be some kind of superstition almost about even talking about what would happen when the relevant person dies. And this can cause a lot of issues because often then there's no clarity as to what assets are owned, where they are, where what the relevant background and history is. So when then the person dies, there's obviously the grieving and the trauma of the death, but then there's an additional trauma of trying to figure out what's happening in terms of the transfer of wealth and how it can be funded. So is that something that you see being a real issue in Africa?
Yeah, I think it's commonplace across the continent and perhaps wider. Look, nobody likes thinking about death, but I think there's one thing worse than dying, and that's having your legatees pay a huge tax bill that may not have been necessary.
Yeah.
Make a bad situation worse. And as you said, it comes at a nasty time. You're already grieving, and then suddenly there's this tax problem to wrestle with and fight with. And it does seem to be a sort of superstition based. Oh, if I write a will, it will hasten the day that I'll need it. oh, my successors will need it, which I don't think is true. And probably you owe it as a form of responsibility to your family to make life a bit easier for them. Otherwise, you run the risk of leaving them with severe problems, emotional, financial, and just organizational, working out, as you just said, Gideon, what assets are there, where are they, who's supposed to be getting them, how much tax are we going to pay on them, etc. But I think linked to that, yeah, and is then do some research. Knowing what's going to happen is a good start, and then thinking what you can do about it. Yeah, if you're trying to reduce your UK inheritance tax, for example, you're going to spend a lot of time not achieving very much, as far as I can see, especially now. And if you're a non-resident and you own a piece of property there, not much you can do. The best answer is don't have a piece of property there. Now, if you're in your home country, then a bit more understanding of what will happen might be useful. In some of these countries, their rules on giving your assets away during your lifetime are not as sophisticated as those that might apply in the UK or South Africa, for example. South Africa with its donations tax, UK with its 7-year rule. But yeah, how can you get your value of your assets down? Or what other planning can you do? Yeah, South Africa and the UK, common thing is leave everything to your spouse, which at least puts off the evil day of paying the tax man. But can I give things away? Can I put things into trust? Yeah, which is a form of giving things away. Can I put them into some sort of wrapper if it's an investment that it's no longer really mine, or it gets rolled up, etc., or it gets passed straight through to the legatees rather than forming part of the estate. There are things that can be done. There's tricks to use. I think overall, I think a common planning technique I've seen in many African countries, perhaps broader, is don't die. And it's a very appealing technique, but not always easy to achieve.
Yeah, and I think that really is the main message we would want to give, having seen so many families suffer from not thinking about what's going to happen on death. And plan upfront. We all know that we're all going to die one day, and we all know that tax applies to everyone. So it's very easy to just bury your head under the sand and not think about what's going to happen to your wealth when you die, but it is not a good idea. And I think especially across Africa, it's because there isn't such a sophisticated system of inheritance tax. A lot of people do ignore it, and a lot of wealth in Africa is multi-generational, multi-family wealth, and it can have very complex and very expensive tax implications, both in the residence country and in the location of the assets, if it is not carefully considered upfront. So again, our recommendation is plan upfront, plan carefully, and then you can rest easy.